The night two worldviews collided. I was sitting in the hall when the conversation took a sharp turn from calm philosophy into something raw, emotional, and unsettling. What began as an academic discussion about the existence of God slowly transformed into a confrontation between two radically different ways of seeing the world. Mufti Shumail spoke first, calmly but with confidence. He invited everyone to imagine the world not through emotions, but through data. He asked us to look at maps of Europe and maps of the Middle East. One, he said, represented societies that had largely moved away from religion. The other was deeply religious. According to him, UN reports showed that workplace sexual harassment affected a staggering percentage of women in liberal European societies, while such cases were far lower in religious regions. To him, this wasn't coincidence. Religion, he argued, wasn't the problem, it was the solution. He then challenged Javed Akhtar directly. If morality does not come from God, then where does it come from? What standard decides good and evil if God is removed from the equation? When Javed Akhtar responded, the atmosphere changed. He dismissed the framing entirely. He said logic had already been abandoned when faith entered the discussion. Words like metaphysical, he argued, were being used as intellectual escape routes labels applied whenever reasoning failed. If something cannot be explained logically, he said, then calling it metaphysical does not solve the problem. It only avoids it. Then he turned to the argument about God's power. If God is all-powerful, all-present, and fully aware, Javed asked, then what kind of world is this? He spoke about children dying of hunger, of disease, of bombs. He described Gaza, where thousands of children, many younger than 10, had died violently. He painted images of starvation, of bodies turning blue from illness, of suffering witnessed by an allegedly omnipotent being who does nothing. If such a God exists, he said, and watches all this without intervening, I feel no reverence for him. He added bitterly that even human leaders, flawed as they are, at least try to help their people. What kind of being demands worship while allowing such injustice to continue? Mufti Shumail replied that Javed Akhtar's entire argument rested on misunderstandings. God, he explained, is not only merciful and powerful, but also all-wise and all-knowing. Human beings judge reality from a limited perspective, like seeing a single pixel of a vast image. What appears meaningless or cruel may carry wisdom that humans cannot grasp. To explain this, he used an analogy. When a doctor gives a painful injection to a child, the child experiences only pain, but the doctor sees healing. Similarly, human suffering, he argued, cannot be judged without considering a broader, unseen context. Javed Akhtar rejected the analogy immediately. A doctor is educated, accountable, and visible. God, he said, offers none of that transparency. Comparing bombed children to medical treatment, he argued, was not wisdom, it was moral evasion. The debate then shifted to the problem of evil. Mufti Shumail argued that evil exists because humans have free will. God created the system, but humans choose how to act within it. Rape, murder, oppression, these are not God's actions, but humanity's misuse of freedom. Evil, he said, is necessary for moral testing. Without wrong choices, there is no test, no accountability, no justice in the afterlife. Javed Akhtar pushed back sharply. If billions of free wills are allowed to destroy millions of lives, then who is responsible, the system or the individuals? If God can grant jobs, marriages, visas through prayer, then why not stop bombs? Why not save children? Mufti Shumail answered that ultimate justice does not occur in this world. This life, he said, is a test. The hereafter is where balance is restored. Without belief in God, he argued, suffering becomes meaningless. With belief, suffering is temporary and compensated. Javed Akhtar rejected this entirely. Delaying justice to another world, he said, is the oldest trick of power. It excuses cruelty today by promising fairness tomorrow. To him, morality does not come from divine command but from human empathy, the simple understanding that pain is wrong because we feel it. The discussion moved into deeper philosophical territory: contingency, infinite regress, and the origin of the universe. Mufti Shumail argued that everything dependent must ultimately rest on a necessary being, God. Javed Akhtar responded that stopping inquiry at God is arbitrary. If God can be eternal without explanation, why not the universe itself? Then came morality. Mufti Shumail claimed that without God, morality collapses into majority opinion, dangerous, shifting, and historically disastrous. Javed Akhtar replied that morality evolved because humans cannot survive without cooperation. Compassion did not come from heaven. It came from living together. As the audience entered the discussion, emotions intensified. Gaza returned to the center of the conversation. Some accused Mufti Shumail of justifying suffering. Others accused Javed Akhtar of stripping victims of hope. Javed insisted that opposing injustice is a human responsibility, not a divine test. Mufti Shumail insisted that opposing injustice is meaningful because God commands it. Finally, the closing statements arrived. Mufti Shumail said the atheist worldview offers no objective foundation for morality, no ultimate justice, and no explanation for existence. God, he concluded, is the only coherent answer. Javed Akhtar stood up and said something quieter, but heavier. He said that if a supreme power exists and watches suffering without intervention, then its existence makes no moral difference. Faith, he argued, always arrives as a package. Rituals, commands, exclusions, and history shows that these packages repeatedly fail. Humanity, he said, is slowly learning to think without surrendering reason. Religion, he predicted, would fade not overnight, but inevitably. As applause filled the hall, I realized this debate had never really been about God alone. It was about where humans place responsibility, in heaven or in themselves. And that question, unresolved, lingered long after the microphones were turned off. Conclusion: why the argument ultimately favored Mufti Shumail. When the dust of rhetoric settles and emotion is set aside, debates are not decided by applause, sharp one-liners, or moral outrage alone. They are decided by coherence, explanatory power, and the ability to answer fundamental questions without contradiction. When examined through this lens, the debate between Mufti Shumail and Javed Akhtar ultimately leaned in favor of Mufti Shumail, not because he appealed to faith alone, but because his worldview consistently answered the questions Javed Akhtar raised, while Akhtar's position repeatedly stopped at rejection without offering a workable alternative. Javed Akhtar's approach throughout the debate relied heavily on negation rather than construction. He was highly effective at expressing moral discomfort, emotional outrage, and skepticism. But skepticism is not a philosophy in itself. To reject an explanation is easy. To replace it with a coherent system is far more difficult. This is where his argument repeatedly fell short. One of Akhtar's central objections was the existence of suffering, especially the suffering of innocent children. He returned to this point again and again, emotionally anchoring his argument in real-world tragedies. While this evokes sympathy, and rightly so, it does not logically disprove the existence of God. At best, it challenges a certain expectation of how God should act. Mufti Shumail responded by clarifying that this expectation itself is a human projection, not a logical necessity. The inability to reconcile divine wisdom with human pain does not negate the existence of God. It merely highlights the limitations of human perspective. Crucially, Javed Akhtar never answered the counter-question. If there is no God, what makes suffering objectively wrong? He assumed moral outrage as self-evident, but never explained its foundation. Without God, morality becomes either a biological impulse or a social agreement, both of which are contingent, changeable, and historically unreliable. Mufti Shumail exposed this weakness by repeatedly asking where moral authority comes from in an atheistic worldview. Akhtar responded with appeals to empathy, evolution, and human conscience, but these are descriptive explanations, not normative ones. They explain how humans feel, not why those feelings should be binding. Another major weakness in Akhtar's stance was his inconsistent standard of evidence. He demanded empirical proof for God, while freely accepting abstract, unprovable concepts such as moral obligation, human dignity, justice, and meaning. None of these can be measured scientifically, yet Akhtar treated them as unquestionable realities. Mufti Shumail rightly pointed out this inconsistency. Rejecting metaphysics while relying on metaphysical assumptions is not rational skepticism, it is selective acceptance. Furthermore, Akhtar repeatedly mocked metaphysical explanations as intellectual escapes, yet offered no explanation for the ultimate origin of existence. When Mufti Shumail presented the classical argument of contingency, that dependent things require a necessary foundation, Akhtar's response was not a refutation but a refusal. He simply asserted that the universe might be eternal, without evidence, while rejecting God's eternity as irrational. This is not logic, it is preference. Mufti Shumail's strength lay in systemic thinking. His worldview accounted for existence, morality, suffering, and justice within a single coherent framework. Whether one agrees with it or not, it answered the questions posed. Akhtar's worldview, by contrast, fragmented under scrutiny. It excelled at criticism but collapsed when required to explain meaning, obligation, or purpose beyond human convenience. On the issue of justice, the contrast was even clearer. Mufti Shumail argued that without an afterlife, injustice is ultimately permanent. Millions suffer and die without resolution. Akhtar dismissed this as a postponement tactic, yet offered nothing in its place. If there is no ultimate justice, then outrage becomes emotional theater rather than moral demand. Condemning injustice while denying any final accountability reduces justice to sentiment, not principle. Perhaps the most telling aspect of the debate was Akhtar's non-answer behavior. When faced with questions about moral grounding, ultimate meaning, or objective values, he consistently shifted back to emotional examples rather than addressing the philosophical issue itself. Emotion is powerful, but it does not substitute for reasoning. Mufti Shumail, on the other hand, addressed both emotion and structure, acknowledging pain while explaining its place within a broader metaphysical reality. This does not mean Mufti Shumail claimed to have all answers. Rather, he acknowledged human limitation while grounding meaning in something beyond human subjectivity. Akhtar rejected transcendence, but still demanded transcendent standards of justice and goodness. This contradiction remained unresolved. In the end, the debate revealed something deeper than belief versus disbelief. It revealed the difference between a worldview that explains reality and a worldview that reacts to it. Javed Akhtar reacted passionately, eloquently, and emotionally, but reaction is not resolution. Mufti Shumail explained methodically, philosophically, and consistently. For those seeking emotional validation, Akhtar's words resonated. But for those seeking answers to fundamental questions, why anything exists, why morality matters, why suffering is meaningful rather than absurd, the answers, however uncomfortable, came from Mufti Shumail's side. Thus, judged not by applause or viral clips, but by logic, completeness, and philosophical responsibility, the conclusion is clear. Mufti Shumail presented a coherent worldview. Javed Akhtar presented a critique without a replacement. And in serious intellectual inquiry, coherence ultimately outweighs complaint.